So I'd like to welcome now Dr. Kevin Welch, who is with the ARS Poisonous Plants Research Lab, and we've invited him here today to visit with us about poisonous plants, which I know is always of interest to everybody. So welcome and thank you for joining us today, Kevin.
Thank you for having me. It's always fun to get a chance to talk about what we do. So as Melinda said, I'm at the USDA Poisonous Plant Research Lab. For those of you that don't know who we are, we're a federal government lab. We're located on Utah State's campus. And our mission, put my slides to forward here. There we go. So our mission at the Poisonous Plant Research Lab is to basically learn as much as we can about poisonous plants, their toxins, the animals they poison, and any diagnostic and prognostic procedures. We want to identify the conditions that animals are poisoned, and that's always one of the more problematic things, because some of these plants at certain times can be nutritious forages for animals, and at other times they're a very problematic poisonous plant. And then we take as much information as we can get, we put that together to develop a management strategy, and then we try and give that information to ranchers, livestock producers, extension agents, anyone who might benefit from that information. So that's just a little bit about who we are. So when we talk about poisonous plants, it always comes down to the dose. Has already been mentioned today, there's several forages that people use and use quite on a regular basis with good results. But if those animals eat too much of that plant too quickly, it can be a poison. And so most times it comes down to the dose. And so really it becomes a balancing act to try and figure out how we can use and effectively use our rangelands and our pastures to help in our production of our animals while not overgrazing those rangelands or running into poisonous episodes. And one thing that we've found that is kind of a general universal issue is that any animals that are in poor body condition, that are hungry, tend to eat more of plants that are poisonous. And oftentimes, especially with sheep, what we find is that a lot of times those sheep die shortly after they've been hauled to a new location. And during that panning and hauling procedure, they become pretty hungry and they get dropped off in a dense patch of a poisonous plant. And that's when a lot of the problems occur. So trying to keep the animals in good nutrition, trying to keep them fed, as have already been mentioned this afternoon, that a lot of effort can be made to try and keep those animals fed so they're not super hungry when you let them out in a new area. Another thing that we try and recommend is that people not do things like I'm showing here in this picture, where people will put a salt block right in the middle of a dense larkspur patch. And larkspur, fortunately, is not an issue for sheep, but it's just this concept that you don't want to put your salt licks or your water troughs in an area where you have a dense patch of a poisonous plant. Now, the problem that may arise is a lot of times where these areas are can become beaten down, as that you see around this water trough, and then you can get invasion of certain poisonous plants like halogen and some of those. So they might not have been there to start with, but they can come in afterwards. And so it's just something you have to be aware of. So here's a list of some of the plants that I wanted to go over today. So this talk is actually a talk that I've given before, but usually I give it in an hour's time. So I'm trying to condense that. So hopefully I can get through this and give enough information to be useful. But if anyone has any questions or wants further information, you're more than welcome to contact me later on. But some of the more problematic plants for sheep are skunk cabbage, which is a veratrum. Death camas is a really big problem that we see a lot of here in the Intermountain West. Lupine is a problem. It tended to be a bigger problem in the years past, but it can still be a problem. Local weeds is still a big problem. So is halogen, greasewood, and horsebrush. Some others that can be problematic that are usually not as big of a deal, listed here on the right. And those are usually a little easier to manage around and avoid some significant problems. So death camas is a problem in a lot of areas because it's one of the first plants that really begins to grow in the early spring. So a lot of the poisoning problems that we'll see are early in the spring before a lot of grass and other forages begin to grow, or we'll also see problems with death camas when you get those late spring snowstorms that will cover up the grass and some of these other forages that are pretty small, where the death camas might be a little larger and easier to identify and find. And the foothills, death camas begins to flower and become pretty visible in about this time of the year. Higher elevations, it takes a couple more months. In general, if you have enough other quality forage, death camas doesn't seem to be as big of an issue. Although I ran into a case, and that was where I showed the picture earlier on, where it was about this time of year, and the rangeland was in really good condition. There was a lot of good forages available, but they brought their sheep in, dropped them off, and lost a couple hundred sheep to death camas overnight. So there's still a lot of things that we don't understand about how and why animals die due to death camas. Sheep do tend to be the most problematic species for death camas, although we have seen a number of reports where cattle have died from death camas as well. So how do you know if death camas is what killed your animal? That's a good question. Animals that die from death camas are usually you just find them dead the next day. But the ones that are alive, you will see a lot of salivation and frothing around their mouth. They're going to be pretty weak down on the ground. As I mentioned, they'll die within a few hours to a day after being put in an area with a lot of death camas. So how do you prevent death camas? Well, the easiest thing to do is just keep them away from dense patches. We really recommend that when you take animals into a new area, that you don't release them right in an area that has a lot of death camas, because they tend to be hungry from being transported. And so you try and keep them away from those dense patches of death camas. Then you also, at night and that when they're being bedded down, you try and keep them away from areas with these dense patches. There's no treatment for death camas poisoning. So once the animal has been poisoned, you kind of have to let it take its course. The only thing that you can really do if you're on a private area, is we have found that there's some pretty good herbicides for controlling deaf camas. And I believe that one of my colleagues at the lab is going to speak later in this seminar series, and he's the one that's done a lot of work with herbicide control. So I'll let him speak about that later on. Okay, another plant that historically was a really big problem was Veratrum californicum, or skunk cabbage. It's got a lot of different names: Western false hellebore, corn lily. I'm showing kind of the early vegetative state here, and then this is the flowered stage. This used to be a really big problem, especially up in central Idaho back in the 1950s, 1960s, where they had a lot of sheep that were being grazed up in these areas that had a lot of the skunk cabbage. And the lambs that were being born from these sheep had a lot of malformations. And I'm just kind of showing a picture here of one of the malformed lambs, and then some of the ewes. So if the ewes consume enough of this plant, it'll actually deform the lamb to the point that the ewe will not be able to give birth. And so you can see these ewes are well past their normal parturition date, and they just have these huge lambs inside of them. And these lambs will not be born normally. They would have to be born via C-section. So with Veratrum, as I mentioned, it's a problem for the ewes, pregnant ewes that eat this, and it's actually a pretty narrow insult period. So the majority of the malformations will happen when the ewes graze the Veratrum between about day 12, 13, up to about day 35. So really it's just that first month of gestation that's an issue. And some of the malformations are pretty significant. There's a lot of craniofacial malformations that you see early on. You'll see some musculoskeletal malformations that will occur later on. And then what I'm showing here is the trachea of an animal that had been malformed. So this is considered tracheal stenosis, and the trachea is collapsed to the point where air cannot flow. And obviously that animal will not do very well when it's born. So management for Veratrum, the easiest thing to do is just not release, turn your pregnant ewes into a Veratrum infested area until after they've been with the rams for more than 30 days. So that they're past that 30-day period of gestation, and they're through that sensitive timing. You can control Veratrum with herbicide treatment. Anything with a 2,4-D herbicide does a pretty good job. Then it also tends to grow in some dense patches, as I'm showing here, and it is possible to fence those off. So it also tends to grow more down just in the wetter, moister areas. And so I know some ranchers have gotten away from problems just by keeping their animals up on the side hill and away from those really moist areas where the Veratrum grows. So another plant that tends to be a really big problem for cows and sheep, and that's the local weeds. Local weeds are the Astragalus and Oxytropis species that contain the toxin swainsinine. I'm showing here a picture of several different species of local weeds that tend to be more problematic here in the Intermountain West. And this is a distribution map of these more problematic local weeds, and you can see there's pretty much everywhere in the Intermountain West there's one type or another of a local weed. You probably do need to have somebody that's pretty knowledgeable as far as the botany goes to identify the local weeds, because there's hundreds of Astragalus and Oxytropis species or even thousands that are not local weeds because they don't produce the toxin swainsonite. So there's a lot of plants, a lot of vetches and that you'll see out in the rangelands that are actually good forages because they're not the local weeds. So clinical signs of animals have been poisoned by local weed. One of the main things you'll see is weight loss, kind of a wasting. You'll see it in all different species of animals. Horses tend to be one of the more susceptible ones. And so you can see in this picture here with the horse that's been poisoned by local weed. The reason it got its name, local weed, loco means crazy in Spanish. And so it's the crazy weed. And the reason it got that name is because it causes an abnormal behavior in animals. They kind of start to act crazy. And so that's one of the things you'll start to see, especially in an animal like a horse that tends to be a little more skittish animal to start with. It does cause a lot of reproductive dysfunction, both in males and females. And so it can cause quite a problem in your reproductive animals as well. In cattle, it causes a right heart failure. And so they call it brisket disease. And you can see that in this cow down in the right-hand corner. And this happens when the animals graze the local weed up at a high elevation. So usually like 9,000 to 10,000 feet or higher is when they'll have problems with that. So how to reduce losses due to local weed? Well, one of the main things is try and avoid the local weed during pregnancy because it causes such a problem with not only reproduction, but also development of the lambs. We recommend the use of intermittent grazing patterns. So there's a lot of areas where they really have a hard time getting away from the local weed, but if they can try and develop some local weed free pastures or ranges and then use an intermittent grazing, that seems to work pretty well. Local weed is a chronic poisoning. So as I mentioned, like with death camas, you know, that's it's a pretty acute. It happens overnight. With local weed, it takes weeks to months for the animals to be poisoned to the point that they become, you know, start to see the wasting syndrome, start to see the abnormal behavior. The reproductive problems will happen a little sooner, but it'll still take a couple weeks for that to happen. So if they can have an area where they can get off that local weed, it has a pretty short half-life. So if they can have good, clean forage for a few days, it really helps them to kind of get that cleared out of their system. We recommend not using the males for breeding unless they've been off local weed for over 90 days, just so that they can get all the abnormal sperm out of their system and get some good, clean, quality sperm ready for the breeding season. So the animals that have been on local weed for a month or more, they tend to develop a permanent neurological disorder. And once the animals get that bad, a lot of times the only thing you can do is put them down because some of the other problems that you'll see can, the animals can recover from those, but once they get those neurological disorders, it's pretty much a permanent problem. So moving on to lupine. Lupine is a pretty common plant that we'll see out in the rangelands in the west, Intermountain West. Showing a picture here that's pretty typical of a lot of areas in the Intermountain West where you get these dry rangelands and you'll get these lupines that can be pretty prevalent in some areas. These losses may be pretty large losses when the sheep are trailed through the areas late in the summer. The when the lupin is in the pod stage, those seed pods have an extremely high concentration of the toxin in those. So if the animals eat the lupin when they're in the pod stage, which tends a lot of times is kind of the late summer, August time period, that's when it tends to be the more problematic. Lupin remains toxic even when it's been harvested and dry. So if you have lupin in your hay fields, that lupin will still be toxic as a hay. So that's something to keep in mind. And this is last bullet is more of an issue for cattle, but it does cause birth defects in cattle that have eaten the lupin during about the first 70 to 100 days of gestation. The susceptible period in cattle for lupin birth defects is, we generally say, is around day 40 to day 100. So reducing losses from lupin, again, just try and keep hungry animals away from dense lupin patches, and also try and keep them away from lupin during the late summer period when it's even more toxic. Supplemental feeding during these times can be beneficial. And so the lupin in sheep, it causes a neuromuscular toxicity. And so if the sheep become poisoned, you want to kind of leave them alone and not try and move them, and just allow them to recover. Because if you try and move them while they're poisoned, it makes it worse. Any stress and movement that they have when they're poisoned will make the poisoning worse. Again, there's not really a treatment for lupin poisoning, so the best thing to do is to keep them from becoming poisoned, keeping them away from the lupin, supplementing their feed. And then obviously it's a broadleaf plant, so again, anything with 2,4-D would do a pretty good job and as an herbicide to control lupin. Another big problem, really big historic problem, especially in some areas here in northern Utah and some other areas, is the oxalate containing plants, especially halogen. We've had some really big losses with sheep due to halogen in the years past, and I think sheep producers are getting more educated and understanding about halogen and how it works and how they can manage around it, so it doesn't tend to be as big of a problem if you know what you're facing and you can manage accordingly. So the leaves and the halogen, and this is something that's pretty typical of what you'll see with halogen, is this kind of this bare area you'll see along the side of the road. You'll just see the halogen come in and take over this area. And you'll see the same in some areas, like where they've, if they brought in watering troughs and left them there for a long period of time, and the sheep would come in and really worn that down, the halogen can come into that area as well. But the highest concentration of the oxalate is in the leaves, and it tends to increase with maturity. And we've done some studies and we've shown that even a half pound of halogen can be lethal to a full-grown sheep. But the good thing about halogen and any oxalate-containing plant is that if you can slowly introduce the animals to this, that the rumen microbes will be conditioned to the oxalate, and they'll begin to metabolize the oxalate and keep it from poisoning the animals. So if they can be slowly introduced to halogen, they'll kind of develop a tolerance to it. And then they won't be, it takes a lot higher dose for them to become poisoned. If they do become poisoned, you'll usually start to see that just a couple 2 to 6 hours after they've eaten enough, and you'll usually see death within half a day after them consuming a lethal amount. So how do we reduce losses due to halogen? Again, supplemental feeding helps. And this is, a good idea if you have these areas that are high dense populations of halogen. If you can supplement their feed and allow them to get a little bit of halogen, but not too much, they can develop that tolerance. Again, kind of a theme of most of what I've talked about is after a long transport of animals, you might want to consider a supplement feeding them before you release them, so they get that room and fill. They're not so hungry and just going out and start grazing indiscriminately on the halogen. One thing we have seen is that animals do tend to eat more halogen after they've been watered. So again, it's kind of a bad scenario if animals get transported, released right in an area that has the water troughs and also has a lot of halogen around it. That's when a lot of losses have happened in the past. And again, you can control halogen with herbicides, and especially if they're really small, it works pretty well. But if you see an area like this, it's pretty much infested this whole area, it's pretty hard to control that. And but do the best you can. There are quite a few other plants, as already been mentioned, some of these alternative forages that are good forages for sheep that sometimes can contain oxalates. Usually these, like lamb's quarter and curly dock, will have oxalates, but they're usually not that high of a concentration. So most of the time the sheep will probably be able to eat these. These don't tend to be really dense patches, so they're probably not going to get a very big dose of the oxalate from eating these. But it's just something to be aware of. Another plant that we've seen that has caused some pretty significant losses to sheep is horsebrush. There's two different species of horsebrush that grow in the Great Basin area. One's a little leaf horsebrush, and then a spineless horsebrush. And what we've seen is that most losses from horsebrush occur during stormy periods when sheep change their grazing habits. And as we've mentioned, for almost all these plants, hungry sheep tend to eat more horsebrush than full sheep, which just makes sense. The plant's especially dangerous during the bud stage, and we think that part of that's maybe it's just because it's more palatable at that time. So all parts of the plants are poisonous, but usually the sheep will only eat the buds and the leaves, and the really fine stems. The really coarse stuff they'll stay away from. So reducing losses to horsebrush, again, just avoid dense ranges when trailing the sheep, and especially try and keep them away from these areas during stormy periods or after they've been watered. And the horsebrush does cause a liver injury, so you will see some secondary photosensitization issues. So if you see animals start to become poisoned or they've been eating a lot of horsebrush, you might want to find a shady spot for them to try and get them out of the sun to try and reduce that photosensitization that will happen. Again, provide some supplemental feed as you can. So moving on to milkweeds. Now we're kind of moving into some of the plants that aren't typically that a big concern. They're just something to maybe be aware of and know if maybe if you lose some animals, these might be some plants that maybe you could throw on your list of potential culprits. So milkweeds, there's a lot of milkweeds in the Intermountain West. Some are pretty toxic, others are not that big of a problem. This again, it tends to be more of a problem in hungry animals that are grazing in an area that where there tends to be a dense patch of milkweed. And sometimes you'll see this and around corrals or bed grounds or on driveways. You know, it's kind of an invasive plant that you'll see come into these barren areas. So the toxin in the milkweed's a cardiotoxin, so it is pretty toxic. So you will, if the animals consume a large amount of the milkweed, they will die within, a few hours. It just kind of depends on how much plant material that they ate. Again, supplemental feeding is a good way of helping keep them from eating the milkweed. And again, milkweed is another one of these that once it's been cut and dried, it's still toxic. So you want to make sure you don't have your milkweed contaminated in your hay. And milkweed again can be controlled with a 2,4-D or another broadleaf plant. You can use glyphosate, Roundup in that. If it's in an area where, if it's on a roadside or around your corrals or bed grounds or, wherever where you're not trying to, don't need to worry about killing your valuable forages too. Hemp Dogbane, again, I'm just kind of getting into some of these plants that I just kind of want to make you aware of. They don't tend to be a big issue. Animals normally won't eat much hemp dogbane. Again, it tends to be more of a problem during times of the year when they don't have a lot of other forages and they're just trying to eat whatever they can find. And again, with the dogbane, it is toxic as a green plant and a dried plant. And it can be controlled with 2,4-D. We've already had a little bit of discussion about some plants that do contain cyanide. Two that can be problems for sheep are chokecherry and serviceberry, but generally these are not a big issue because the sheep generally just won't eat enough of them. But they, it's not the kind of thing that you want to have as a shrub or that around anywhere that's near the livestock, where the livestock will be. So with chokecherry, a lot of people, when we talk about chokecherry containing cyanide, they'll say, well, what about chokecherry pies? Well, the berries are edible. They don't have cyanide in the berries. It's in the seed. The seeds do have them. But the biggest problem is in the leaves. That's where most of the cyanide is. And that was kind of the more problematic plants that I wanted to go over with you today. And just let me know if there's any questions that you might have.
Well, thank you so much for that overview. I definitely didn't realize a couple of those things were toxic to sheep, so that was very helpful. Do you feel like there's certain ones that are more common in the Intermountain West that people need to be aware of than others?
Yeah, for sure. So I would probably, I'd be curious to see what the producers have to say, but I know death camas is a real big problem. That's something we get calls about every year. Locoweed is another one that's a really big problem, and that's really widespread. Halogen is kind of more spotty, but in the areas where there's a lot of halogen, it can be really problematic until you really learn how to manage around it. You know, the fact that you can develop a tolerance to halogen kind of helps with the management a little bit.
Sure, and that would be more of like a active move them in and out over a short duration every day or something.
Yeah, you know, and as for most of these, you know, the big thing you just don't want to do is bring in a truckload of hungry sheep and put them in a dense patch of any of these plants, because that's when you're going to run into trouble.
Are there any different subspecies of lupin that are more toxic than others?
There are, and that's a really good point. So not all lupin are the same. They have, you have to get the right species of lupin with the right chemistry. And so again, you know, it's kind of like the astragalus thing. Just because you have an astragalus doesn't mean it's a toxic plant. So you kind of, and I don't know off the top of my head which species of lupin are the most problematic. I can find that out. So if you know, if that, whoever asked that question, you know, just send me an email and I can find that answer for you.
Great. Well, that caps out our questions, and I really appreciate you joining us today.